Please don't leave tonight. Clara Bennett did not say it loudly. The April storm was doing enough shouting for both of them. Rain rattled across the warped shingles over the west side of the barn, and every hard burst of wind made the loosened boards answer with a dry, worried knocking sound, as if the whole building had teeth and could not keep them from chattering. Lantern light moved across the straw in a thin gold circle. It caught the line of Ezra Cole's shoulder where his shirt was dark with rain, the hammer hanging from 2 fingers of his right hand, the mud dried in the seams of his boots, the plain surprise in a man's face that had already learned not to expect to be asked for anything except labor. Clara stood in the doorway with her hand wrapped around the jamb so tightly, her knuckles had gone pale beneath the barn dust. Behind her, the wind carried the smell of wet cottonwood bark up from Hermosa Creek and the frightened shifting of her mare in the far stall. She had spent 26 months asking weather, debt, and loneliness for mercy and receiving none. It unsettled her to hear herself ask a man instead. Some words only arrive when losing something makes them honest. That afternoon, before the storm had come down from the San Juan Range and laid its gray belly over La Plata County, Clara had found him on the outside ladder with a cedar plank braced against one thigh and her barn half repaired under his hands. She was 31 years old in the spring of 1894, a widow by 26 months, owner-in-law and by necessity of 126 acres 6 miles north of Durango where the lower bend of Hermosa Creek widened enough to lay a ribbon of green through the pasture. She had 43 head of cattle after the winter cull, 11 milk cows, 2 hired boys in haying season when she could afford them, a mortgage balance of $684 held through the First San Juan Bank, and 2 children who had grown older in manners faster than they had in inches. O'Donnell in town knew every age worth knowing, and she knew his trade because only a carpenter would look at another person's barn and begin correcting it before introducing himself. Clara had ridden in from the lower field with a sack of seed corn across the saddle horn and seen him there against the boards as plainly as if somebody had nailed him to the structure along with the fresh timber. He had his hat tipped low and 1 boot hooked around a rung, and he worked with an economy that offended her first by being competent and then by being uninvited. Luke stood below passing up nails from a tobacco tin, trying hard to look useful and failing in the way boys often do when they are admiring a grown man. May sat on an overturned bucket by the open doors, hugging the barn cat to her apron and tracking every movement Ezra made as if he were performing a trick he had not named yet. When Clara asked what, precisely, he thought he was doing, Ezra had looked down, measured her expression correctly, and answered without hurry that the west brace was split, the loft door hung crooked, and the next heavy snow would lay half the roof on her hay if somebody didn't intervene before then. He said it like weather, not rude, not meek, just true. Luke confessed, after 1 guilty second, that he had mentioned the barn at the Mercantile when Ezra asked whether anybody around Hermosa needed day labor. Clara should have been angrier at the boy than she was, but she had been looking at the neat fit of the new brace, at the fact that Ezra had chosen matching wood instead of scraps, and at the way a stranger had put his back into saving something her own hands had not managed to reach. "If you're set on working," she said, "I'll pay a fair day's wage for a fair day's labor." Ezra wiped his thumb along the cedar grain, glanced once at the sky already whitening toward weather, and answered, "A meal and a place out of the rain will do until we settle the rest." May, deciding the matter needed cheer, called up to him that if he meant to fix their barn he was not allowed to leave before pie. Ezra laughed then, quick and surprised, and Clara hated how much the sound warmed the yard. He might have finished the brace and walked on if the mare had not kicked through the weakened stall rail an hour later, just as the first wind found the property. Trouble accelerated everything between them. By the time Clara had unsaddled, the clouds were stacked over the ridges west of town like iron plates. Luke was shouting from inside the barn. May had begun to cry because the mare was thrashing against the split timber, and Ezra was already there, moving. He went over the half-hung gate instead of around it, caught the mare's halter without being struck, spoke to her in a low voice Clara could not fully hear over the storm, and braced his shoulder against the rail while Luke dragged out the loose nails and Clara fetched the rope. There was nothing showy in it. That was what marked her. He did not look around to see whether anyone noticed he was strong or calm or useful. He merely used what he had as if usefulness were the only language worth speaking in a hard moment. They got the mare settled, the rail lashed, the loft hatch bolted, and 3 bales pulled away from the drip line before the rain came down in earnest. When the creek bridge washed slick and the north track turned black with mud, Clara did the arithmetic of danger in one breath and practicality in the next. The O'Donnell boarding house was too far in the storm, town farther, and the line shack south of the cottonwoods was not fit in that weather. So she had found herself in the barn doorway with wind in her hair and the smell of wet hay all around them, asking the stranger with rain on his sleeves not to leave that night. Ezra's eyes had lifted to hers and stayed there one beat longer than politeness required. Then he nodded once, as if he had been given a burden and trusted with it. Trust often begins before affection knows its own name. He slept in the loft that night with Luke's old army blanket and woke before dawn to lay 2 more planks where the rain had worked through the siding. Clara saw him from the kitchen window while the coffee heated. The east was only barely silver. He stood against the barn with his sleeves rolled and his breath visible in the early cold, using her hammer as carefully as if it had belonged to someone he meant to answer to. That mattered to her. Samuel had owned good tools and hated to see them abused. And after he died there had been too many men who treated a widow's property like a place where standards could be softened because no husband stood nearby to enforce them. Ezra did the opposite. He squared corners nobody would praise. He set nails true where only weather would know if he had not. When Clara carried out biscuits wrapped in a towel and told him breakfast was inside if he wanted it, he climbed down from the ladder and wiped his boots on the threshold without being told. May, with the solemnity of a child maintaining household law, reminded him again not to leave before pie. He said he would do his best to obey. Luke followed him everywhere at breakfast, asking what kind of saw cut along the grain better, whether a man could learn framing from books, whether Durango really had as many wagons as people claimed. Clara watched Ezra answer each question plainly and without condescension, and she noticed, to her annoyance, how quickly the room had made space for him. Houses can be quicker than hearts that way. By the second week of April, Tuesdays had become his day at the Bennett place, though nobody officially arranged it. He found labor in town and on neighboring spreads the other days, but on Tuesdays he came up the Hermosa Road with nails in his satchel, rough-cut boards tied behind the saddle, or some small necessary item Clara had mentioned only once and assumed no one except herself had bothered to remember. One Tuesday it was a pump gasket from Durango. Clara tried to tell herself that she allowed the pattern because the place needed him and because wages paid to competence were not charity. Attachment often enters a house wearing the boots of routine. Durango, being a place of fewer than 7,000 souls and more opinions than that, did not fail to observe. Mrs. O'Donnell at the boarding house remarked that Mr. Eli owned half the mercantile stock on Main Avenue and handled local notes for the bank, when Mr. There was nothing contemptible in Eli Mercer. That made him harder to oppose. In May, Ezra took out the sagging east kitchen window and replaced the frame in a single day. Clara had not asked him to. She had only mentioned, while setting bread to rise, that the draft along the sill was bad enough to blow out the lamp in winter if she set it too close. The next Tuesday he arrived with planed pine, glazing putty, 2 iron latches, and a piece of clear glass that caught the noon sun like creek water. He measured twice, cut once, swept every curl of shaving from the floor, and rebuilt the sill square enough that the window opened with 1 hand instead of 2. Then, because he had noticed the children doing sums at the corner of the table where the light failed by late afternoon, he widened the inside ledge and angled it so morning came farther into the room. He said only that east light was kinder if a person planned to read. Clara stood with the flower still on her wrists and looked at the bright rectangle he had made on the worn tabletop. Samuel had always meant to fix that window and had died before getting around to it. She did not tell Ezra that. She only said the work was good. Ezra glanced once at the sunlit boards and once at her face, then went outside to split kindling as if kindness embarrassed him when seen directly. That was how some men offered care. They laid it down and stepped away from it before anyone could call it tender. The house still belonged to Samuel in certain corners, and Clara kept those corners guarded like a widow keeping watch over a grave no one else could see. His old sheepskin coat hung behind the pantry door through spring because she could not yet move it and because Luke still touched the sleeve in passing when he thought no one noticed. His ledger sat in the top desk drawer with the last neat column he had entered on February 11, 1892, wheat sold to the McPhee family, and $20 promised from a neighbor who never quite found the cash. More often it is made of what a person leaves untouched. By June, the grass had come in waist-high along the creek. The cottonwoods had lost their silver newness for a flatter green, and the Bennett place began to look less like a property barely holding itself together and more like a place that expected another winter and intended to meet it standing. Ezra reset 3 fence posts on the south line. He rehung the porch gate so it no longer dragged a furrow in the dust. One week Ezra answered that he was staying only because a man would have to be a fool to walk away from peach pie. Joy is rarely dramatic when it returns. It usually comes back carrying nails. The first visible hitch in the new arrangement came at the July church picnic near Onemus City. Clara wore a high-necked blue calico dress with long sleeves despite the heat because propriety in town lasted longer than common sense, and she braided May's hair with white ribbon Ruth Calder had insisted suited her. Ezra drove the wagon because Luke claimed the left wheel still pulled and because Clara let him. It was not innocent either. That night, washing dust from the picnic glasses, she thought about the way silence can look like dignity and feel like distance. She recognized the loss of Tuesday before noon the next week. That was the shameful truth of it. She had no right to expect him. He owed the Bennett place only the labor already arranged and paid for. Ezra came on Wednesday instead, apologizing with a plainness that made apology seem almost too grand a word. The heart dislikes being caught in habits the mind has not approved. Not a Tuesday, which she noticed. The cedar became the quietest and perhaps the most intimate thing Ezra did all summer. Samuel's old tackroom door had swollen and split along the lower panel, so badly that Clara had long since taken to setting a stone against it in weather. The room smelled of leather, dust, and old effort. Most days she opened it only when necessity forced her. Ezra asked, in the same tone he might have asked permission to move a bucket, whether he might put the hinge side right and replace the rotten bottom rail. Clara nearly said no from reflex. Then she looked at the door, at the cracked panel, the rising damp, the inevitable rot that grief had not stopped, and stepped aside. Ezra worked there half a day with the wide doors open to the sun. He cut the new rail from the cedar he had hauled in, scraped the old paint down, and reset the hinges so the door met the frame without complaint. Then, using an offcut, he built a small wall peg and fixed it above Samuel's chest where the old bridle could hang clear of mice and damp. He did not make a speech about preserving memories. He only set the bridle there when he finished, one hand under the worn leather as if lifting something heavier than hide. Clara watched from the threshold with May beside her and felt, for the first time since Samuel died, that memory had been tended instead of merely guarded. Grief does not need a grand monument. Sometimes it only needs dry wood and a straight hinge. Later that same week, near sundown, Luke asked the question Clara herself had circled for months without touching. They were by the creek where Ezra was replacing 2 washed fence pickets while the water ran copper in the light. Luke wanted to know whether Ezra had a family anywhere and whether they wrote. The boy asked it bluntly, because childhood believes curiosity can be passed off as innocence even when it strikes close. Ezra drove one staple before answering. Then he said he had had a wife once, outside Pueblo, and a daughter who had lived 19 days. The fever that took the baby took the mother 2 days later, in August of 1887, before the prairie even cooled from summer. After that, he said, he had found it simpler to go where work called and not remain long enough for rooms or roads to begin expecting him. He told it in perhaps 150 words, no more. Clara heard the shape of years inside that small account and understood suddenly why he traveled light, why he never sat with both shoulders against a chair back, why even now he kept his bedroll tied tighter than a settled man would. When Luke, chastened by the answer he had not known he was asking for, wandered after minnows with a willow stick, Clara said quietly that Samuel had died faster than any sentence she could build around it, and that there were mornings she still turned to tell him the weather before remembering. Ezra's hand rested on the fence rail between them, strong and still. Grief doesn't leave, he said. It just learns to share the house with other things. The creek kept moving. So did they. The trouble with a useful man is that a household begins to fit itself around him before anyone publicly agrees that it has. By August, Ezra knew which heifer jumped at thunder, where Luke hid the dull hatchet instead of returning it to the peg, how May liked the crust cut from bread though she pretended otherwise, and which porch board near the third step squealed under Clara's left foot because the nail head rode high. He repaired that board without comment. Ruth Calder saw it first and said so, though gently. But loyalty can become another name for fear if a person leans on it too long. Eli Mercer chose the first Monday of September to speak plainly. Clara had come to town for lamp oil, flour, and school slates for Luke and May. The monsoon rains had passed, leaving the roads rutted but hard. Eli never overreached language. Then he carried her purchases to the wagon and did not once look offended. Decency can pressure a person as firmly as force. That evening Ezra came up from the lower pasture with Luke, a brace of cut fence posts across the wagon bed and dust graying the legs of his trousers. He took one look at Clara's face and asked whether the town had brought bad news. She almost told him about Eli then. There was nothing heroic in it. Just hands blackened by soot, a narrow chisel, and a man making breathing easier in a room that had seen too much of people holding their breath. He stayed because 8-year-old decrees had become household law, and because leaving certain tables grows harder the more they begin to look like home. Autumn sharpened everything. The nights cooled enough in late September that the horses steamed at dawn. Cottonwoods along the creek went from dusty green to a gold so bright it looked almost impolite against the brown hills. Perhaps roofs made people think too much of permanence. Then he drove a post deeper into the earth, and the conversation closed around the blow. There are moments when the future enters quietly and still manages to sound like a door shutting. The town chorus, having waited nearly all summer for Clara Bennett to behave like a woman in a story instead of a ranch ledger, grew less patient as October advanced. Ruth Calder asked whether choosing steadiness from affection was not better than waiting for affection to prove itself steady. Mrs. Cole looked like he already belonged on the property. She began fearing, with the cold clarity of a practical woman, that love was not only possible again but already underway. Fear and hope often wear the same coat until a person looks close. Eli pressed for nothing in public, which made his occasional private firmness feel heavier when it came. On October 28th, after Sunday service, he walked Clara and the children as far as the hitching rail and asked whether she intended to honor the answer date he had named for the harvest supper on November 17th. Clara said yes. "I would rather hear no from you directly," he said, "than hear nothing while the whole county makes stories for us both." By Monday he was back on the south line with fresh-cut posts and a silence that made work sound loud around him. The pivotal argument came at the very edge of the property, where the Bennett South fence dipped toward Hermosa Creek and the ground turned stony under the cottonwoods. A skiff of snow had come early in the first week of November, not enough to hold by afternoon but enough to silver the rails and make every breath visible. Clara found Ezra there near dusk with his coat off, despite the cold, because he was setting the last wire true along a stretch that had troubled them since spring. He had already loaded his spare clothes in the wagon by the line shack. Luke had seen the bundle and said nothing to his mother until the boy could no longer contain it. Clara dismounted before her horse fully stopped and asked whether Silverton required he leave without a goodbye. Ezra kept his eyes on the fence a moment longer, then said men leaving for winter work had no business making a ceremony of it. Clara answered that people who had eaten at her table for 7 months were no longer only men taking winter work. Ezra straightened slowly, one gloved hand on the post mall. The creek moved dark behind him. He said her children deserved steadiness, her note deserved solving, and the town would talk less if he removed himself before he became an obstacle to something respectable. The words angered her more because they were spoken gently. She stepped to the fence, put one hand on the top rail between them, and said that leaving on her behalf without asking what she wanted was not respect but cowardice dressed in manners. Ezra's jaw shifted once. He said maybe so, but he had lived long enough to know that temporary men should not stand in the road of permanent decisions. Clara told him he had built enough permanence on that land to stop pretending he was temporary. The wind pushed dead leaves along the creek bank and pinned one against his boot. For one suspended second he looked like a man at the boundary of two lives, unable to claim either. "If you go," Clara said, "quieter now, don't call it kindness." The fence between them had never felt so literal. Two futures can meet on a rail and still wait for somebody to climb over. He did not leave that evening, but neither did he come to the house. He finished the fence in the failing light, stacked the remaining staples in Luke's coffee tin, and rode down to the line shack with the kind of careful distance that bruises worse than anger. Luke stared into his potatoes. By the time the harvest supper arrived 3 days later, every person involved had grown tired of caution but not yet brave enough to admit it. The supper was held in the church hall south of town, with kerosene lamps hung in rows and long tables carrying hams, beans, boiled potatoes, pickled beets, 8 kinds of pie, and more scrutiny than any congregation had a moral right to claim. Clara wore brown wool with a high collar. May matched her in miniature. Eli asked Clara for a walk to the side doorway where the air off the street came in cool and empty of roast beef scent. The words made her shake afterward, not during. Eli closed his eyes for the length of one breath. When he opened them, the hurt in his face was too plain to ignore and too decent to resent. "I am tired," he said quietly, "of always being the sensible man people trust to lose gracefully." It was the only sharp thing he ever gave her, and because it was true in its own way, she accepted the cut of it. Clara said she was sorry. Eli answered that sorry was not useful currency, then sighed and looked over her shoulder toward the hall. "Still," he went on, with effort and dignity both, "I won't have it said I used a widow's note to purchase what wasn't mine to buy." He told her the bank extension would hold until March 15th whether she married anyone or not. Then he put his hat back on, thanked her for speaking plainly at last, and walked out the side door into the cold. That was the friction of a good man losing. Not rage, but the cost of composure honestly paid. Clara watched him go with tears in her eyes and no confusion left in her mind. The choice became public a minute later because towns are built that way. Ruth Calder saw Clara return alone, saw the state of her face, and knew enough to shepherd May toward the pie table and Luke toward Deputy Larkin before questions could gather. Clara crossed the hall straight to Ezra. He had already read something from the room's altered air and looked ready to step aside for her dignity if she wanted that easier road. Instead she stopped in front of him, with him books stacked behind and 12 opinions hanging above the lamps, and said that if he meant to disappear into Silverton out of mistaken nobility, he was going to make a liar out of her in front of half the county. Ezra stared at her. She did not care who heard the next words. She said she was tired of pretending the house had not changed with him in it, tired of calling gratitude by smaller names than it deserved, and tired of watching her children love a man who behaved as if loving them back obligated him to leave. The hall had gone nearly still. Ezra's face, which so often protected itself by quiet, gave way at last. He said her note was not settled, her winters not easy, and her future too serious for a drifting carpenter. Clara answered that she was not choosing a tidy ledger. She was choosing the man who had built morning light into her kitchen and dry wood around her grief. Luke, brave as boys become when they sense history, took May's hand and grinned at no one in particular. Ruth Calder later swore the whole room exhaled together. Even then Ezra did not answer with a flourish. That was not his way. He said only, "Clara, if I stay honest." They did not kiss there in the church hall under the congregation's delighted stare. It no longer meant distance. It meant the work of making room. Rain came after midnight, a cold November rain with sleet hidden in it, and the barn roof answered the weather with the old familiar knock Ezra had mostly cured in April. He rose from the chair by the stove where he had dozed rather than take the road back to the line shack in darkness, and Clara heard him pull on his coat. By instinct he meant to go out alone and check every latch before weather could find weakness. She met him at the back door with her lantern raised. The same barn stood beyond them, sturdier now. The same wind moved in the cottonwoods. The same man waited, rain on his sleeve. But Clara was not the same woman who had first stood in that doorway months before mistaking necessity for the whole truth. She touched his wrist, felt the startled stillness under his skin, and said the line again with nothing hidden inside it this time. "Please don't leave tonight." Ezra looked at her as if the room had shifted under his feet. Then he set the lantern down, folded one calloused hand around the side of her neck with more reverence than urgency, and kissed her like a man who understood that staying could be an act of courage too. Outside, The rain kept speaking to the roof. Inside, two lonely people finally stopped translating themselves into caution. Winter did not soften because they had chosen one another. Cattle still needed feed before dawn. The bank still expected money, not romance. Snow still drifted against the north side of the barn in January hard enough to bury fence rails. But difficulty shared alters its shape. Ezra declined Silverton. Instead, he took custom framing work from 3 neighboring ranches, repaired wagons in town twice a month, and spent every spare daylight strengthening the Bennett place against the weather. Clara sold 12 yearlings in December at a better price than forecast and put $193 against the note. Eli Mercer kept his word about the extension and, to his credit, never withdrew decent treatment from Luke or May. Ezra and Clara moved carefully through the first months, not because either doubted the other, but because good things can seem fragile when a person has wanted them too long. By February he had built enclosed shelves in the pantry, reset the barn's west hinges completely, and fashioned from spare pine a narrow desk under the east window so Luke could work arithmetic and May could practice her letters in proper light. One Saturday he took Samuel's broken wagon tongue, the same weathered piece Clara had never been able to discard, and made from it a bench beneath the cottonwood near the tack room. He sanded the seat smooth and set the iron bolts flush. When Clara sat there the first time, she rested her palm on the worn grain and felt that the dead had not been replaced. They had simply been joined by the living. They married on March 21, 1895. The first week the lower pasture showed honest green again. Ruth Calder insisted on lilacs in jars despite the season being a shade early. Mrs. O'Donnell cried before anyone else had proper cause. Mateo brought a hammered iron horseshoe polished bright for luck, and Deputy Larkin, who claimed weddings were not his jurisdiction, stood at the back with his hat in both hands and a smile too large to conceal. Luke wore a jacket already a little short in the sleeves because boys refused to stop growing for family events. May wore cream calico with a high collar and long sleeves, and carried no flowers, because she said she preferred holding the ring box where important things belonged. Clara stood on the porch in dove-gray wool, modest and beautiful in a way no town fashion plate could have improved, and Ezra looked at her as if all his restless miles had only been the long road toward that exact step. There was no grand speech. He promised steadiness. She promised truth. The children stood with them, which mattered more than embellishment. Afterward they fed everyone stew and pie in the yard because weather held fair, and when the last wagon rolled away, Ezra stayed behind to stack the borrowed chairs before Clara could suggest it. Marriage had not changed his language. He still loved in lumber, hinges, and small mercies. That was part of why she trusted it. By late June the barn was fully painted. The south fence ran true to the creek, and the Bennett Cole place looked, from the road, like a property that had chosen its own future and built toward it with both hands. May still told Ezra not to leave before pie, though now she did it to hear him laugh. Luke had begun saying our place without catching himself. Clara sometimes found Ezra at dawn by the east window desk, checking figures beside her ledger because numbers no longer belonged to one person alone. On certain evenings she sat with him on the bench made from Samuel's wagon tongue and watched the last light strike the San Juan's pink above the dark timber. Memory sat there with them, but it no longer required a chair of its own. The house had learned to share itself. So had she. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. If the story holds anything worth carrying into your own life, maybe it is this. Not every true devotion arrives with grand declarations, and not every second chance sounds like thunder when it begins. Sometimes it sounds like a hammer on a loose board, or boots on a Tuesday porch, or a man remembering where the draft comes through your kitchen because he has decided your comfort matters as much as his own. We are often taught to look for the loud proof, the dramatic proof, the proof that can be repeated in company. But the heart, when it is honest, is usually won in smaller currencies: reliability, attention, labor freely given, the humility to mend what weather and grief have weakened. Choose carefully the people who build around you. Better still, notice the ones already doing it. And if you have stayed with this family all the way to the end, thank you for sharing the road with them and with me. Stories like these endure because somebody is willing to listen long enough for quiet love to be recognized. Until next time, keep riding. Next, Wait until you hear about the ranch widow who hired a trail cook for 3 days, watched him rebuild her creek gate before sunrise, and met him at the fence line when the spring drive tried to take him away.